George and Rachel were married for about 7 years. During this time, the couple had gotten to know each other extremely well, and thus neither one of them felt any excitement in their relationship anymore. That was mostly due to George's coldness and not the lack of feelings on his wife's part. Rachel always paid a lot of attention to her husband and did her best to support him in all his endeavors. To anyone who didn't know the Wilson couple closely, they looked like the perfect example of a happy family, but that was just an illusion. The fact was that George had stopped loving his wife a long time ago and bluntly said that he was tired of the family life. At first, Rachel believed that things would work out eventually, but over time, she realized that it was just wishful thinking on her part. The worst part, however, was that George had started to behave rather strangely lately. At first, he started staying late at work, which he never did before. Sometimes he could even come home well after midnight. At the same time, George always found a plausible explanation for his late nights at the office, blaming it on the heavy workload. Rachel sincerely believed her husband for quite some time, but when she saw lipstick stains on his shirt, she realized that he was having an affair. The truth was that George was never particularly affectionate with her, but now he'd become cold as ice. Of course, Rachel understood that many relationships get stuck in a rut over time, especially after years of boring routine. What did I do to deserve such treatment? Rachel thought bitterly. That wasn't the only thing that upset the woman, who'd already grown used to the fact that her husband often stayed at work late. It was also the fact that 5 years ago, when Rachel got pregnant, it was George who convinced her to terminate the pregnancy. Being blindly in love with their husband, the naive young woman did what he asked her to do, which caused irreparable harm to her health. Back then, George argued that he wouldn't be able to raise a child and do business at the same time. But when the couple tried to have a baby a little later, it turned out that Rachel simply couldn't get pregnant anymore. She never blamed George for it and believed that she was the only one responsible for what was happening. Despite the fact that Rachel had reasons to suspect that her husband was cheating virtually every day, she continued to cook breakfast, lunch, and dinner for him, as if there was nothing wrong. She understood that what she was doing was strange at the very least, but she couldn't change anything. George basically paralyzed her will and did whatever he pleased. That night, when Rachel was making dinner for her husband and waiting for him alone at home, the man was spending his evening at a restaurant with yet another long-legged beauty. He was infatuated with Monica the moment he saw her, while she quickly made it clear that she knew her worth and expected to get a beautiful courtship and expensive gifts. George knew his way around women and was dead set on seducing Monica. It's hard to say whether the man realized that his wife knew that he was cheating on her or not. Most likely, George simply didn't care, and therefore he fulfilled all his desires and whims without a care in the world. While her husband was having dinner at a restaurant, Rachel sat by the window and watched the raindrops fall on the window pane. The woman felt deeply hurt by her husband, and it seemed that her soul was crying with the rain. George came home late, as usual, and having refused to eat dinner, went to bed. There wouldn't be anything special about that night, but when Rachel was straightening her husband's jacket on the hanger, she accidentally noticed 2 strange pieces of paper sticking out of his pocket. They looked like receipts or a checkbook stubs. Rachel took one of them and turned pale. "So that's why you've been working late," the woman whispered with tears in her eyes. The fact was that the pieces of paper weren't actually receipts or checks, but 2 business-class tickets to Miami. One of the tickets was in George's name, and the other one was issued to some Monica Gleason. It was probably at that moment that Rachel realized how bad the situation really was. After all, the tickets to the ocean coast were too big of a deal to find a plausible explanation for them. If Rachel tried really hard, she could convince herself that the lipstick stains on her husband's shirt got there during an unfortunate hug with the coworker, and that the woman's hair she found belonged to his assistant. But she couldn't lie to herself about the tickets. "A big surprise will be waiting for you when you come back," Rachel thought, and put the tickets back in George's jacket. The woman was feeling miserable. To Rachel's credit, though, it's worth saying that she didn't have the habit of going through other people's pockets, and even that time, she didn't do it on purpose. The next morning, Rachel prepared breakfast and put it on the table for her husband, as if nothing had happened. When George told his wife that he'd be gone for 3 days on a business trip to one of the remote branches of the company, he was so composed that his confidence and self-control could even be admired. "Well, can't someone else go? After all, you're the head of the department, aren't you? Can't you delegate?" Rachel asked cautiously. "No, dear, it's a completely different level of negotiation. They're very important, so I can't trust anyone else with them," George lied without batting an eye. Rachel nodded understandingly and expressed her concern over the fact that her husband was overworking himself. If George had told her where he was actually going, Rachel might have forgiven him. But seeing her husband blatantly lie right in front of her face made the woman resent him. She was particularly outraged by the happy look on her husband's face when he was getting ready for his business trip. Nevertheless, she lovingly packed his shirts and didn't even forget about sunblock. Rachel's first thought was to make a scene and to tell George that she caught him in a lie and knew everything. But then she weighed all the pros and cons and decided to postpone the showdown and make a plan in the meantime. Meanwhile, George was very excited about his trip and was already imagining himself in the arms of the blonde beauty. At the same time, Monica was coming up with the plan of her own, a plan to bag the rich and gullible businessman. Few people knew that it wasn't her first relationship with a married man and that it wouldn't be her last one either. 3 days under the scorching Miami sun flew by in a flash. Having his mind clouded with passion, George didn't even notice that his wife hadn't called him once during all this time. His wife used to always show interest in his work and called him even when he was away on a business trip. The most interesting part was that George didn't even think for a second that Rachel could have found out about his affair. Therefore, when he finally returned home with a sense of accomplishment, he simply opened the door and went into the living room. To his great amazement, the house was quiet, and it didn't smell of anything delicious, which meant that Rachel hadn't cooked dinner for her husband. This had never happened before. Previously, Rachel was always home to greet her husband from his business trips, excited for his return. The living room TV wasn't on either, which made the house especially quiet. Even the wall clock seemed to be ticking quieter than usual. What's going on? George asked himself, having a hard time restraining his irritation. But when the man went into the kitchen, he almost immediately saw a note waiting for him on the table. Rachel was very to the point in her note. All she said that she was leaving and filing for divorce, but she added that she was sincerely happy for her husband and his vacation. How did she even find out? Did someone blab? George thought anxiously. Of course, he suspected that his co-workers had long known about his indiscretions, and therefore he had no illusions about this decency. And yet, George didn't believe that Rachel could have left him for good. It's okay. She'll be gone for a couple of days to cool down and then come back on her own, the man reassured himself, moving from room to room. Having opened the fridge, George found it empty. Before she left, Rachel gave all the food they had to the neighbors so that her husband could get a feeling of real bachelor life as soon as he got home from his trip. Having finally managed to find some canned soup in the pantry, George tried to heat it up. However, the unfortunate businessman didn't even manage to open the can without injuring himself in the process. The throbbing pain in his finger made the man regret what he'd done. Not even knowing how to use the electric stove, George brought the soup to a boil and cooked it until it burned and acquired an extremely unpleasant taste. But that was only the beginning. Within a week, George's house turned into a real pigsty full of cigarette butts, empty bottles, and crumbled bags of chips. Monica came over a couple of times, but she turned out to be the same kind of slob as George. The best Monica could do was order pizza. Needless to say, George was extremely disappointed. In all this time, he had gotten very used to the healthy homemade food that Rachel always lovingly cooked for him. Now he was forced to eat pre-cooked meals and all kinds of fast food. At the same time, George tried to convince himself that he wasn't the only one living like that, and that thousands of bachelors just like him lived around the country. The man didn't take into account one thing, though. He didn't know how to live alone, and was simply incapable of taking care of himself. When he was a kid, his mother did it for him, and then Rachel took over for her mother-in-law and surrounded her husband with love and attention. 2 weeks later, George ran out of patience and tried to get Rachel back. But when the man dialed his wife's number, the indifferent voice on the cell phone operator informed him that the number was no longer in service. What did she do? Did she change her number? George thought anxiously. The man still couldn't come to terms with the fact that he'd actually lost her. Before Rachel left him, George felt like the kind of life he was living was the norm, and that his affairs weren't something he needed to worry about. It was only when he got the divorce papers that George realized that there was no going back to his former life. Due to poor nutrition and lack of proper care, the man became haggard and started looking like he was homeless. His suits were always wrinkled, his shirts dirty, and his shoes hadn't been cleaned in days. Of course, this invariably affected George's performance at work, which led to a serious conversation with his superiors. "George, it doesn't look like you can handle the responsibilities of the head of the department anymore," the director of the company announced at the meeting. Meanwhile, Rachel started a new life in which there was a new man who took great care of her, who was affectionate and attentive. But most importantly, he never lied to her. Rachel and Dylan met accidentally and quickly realized that they were made for each other. That day, Cupid's arrow must have hit right in the target, so the young people's hearts were bonded by love forever. Meanwhile, all that was left for George to do was reminisce about the days when he had his wife's undivided attention and felt like the center of her universe. Left with nothing, George eventually lost his job and nearly ended up being homeless. I'd like to believe that George's example will be one of its kind and that no one else will follow in his unfortunate footsteps.